Let's go. Yeah.
All right. So now we're live. So Levi, do you want to give us the introduction to this topic? Did you wrote it up?
Yeah. So we have some scenarios where we want to introduce a first-class concept that represents UTF-8 textual data. UTF-8 textual data as distinct from binary data, as distinct from UTF-16 textual data. UTF-16 being what System String uses today. Everyone can hear? Yes. Okay. No one in the chat saying they can't hear me, so I'm just going to keep going. So some of the scenarios that we have for this, there's a link to it at the top of the issue here, but I can just briefly go over them. Some of them are very high performance networking scenarios. Say that you have something like Kestrel, HTTP client, something along those lines. And what you might want to do is you might want to say, I have a byte array, I'm reading data into my byte array, and I want to operate on it as if it were UTF-8 textual data. Traditionally, what you would have to do is you would have to transcode that into UTF-16. And this transcoding implies a memcopy. It implies an allocation if you're not using temporary buffers. If you need to stick it into a string, well, you can't use temporary buffers anyway. That's an allocation. So we might have scenarios where HTTP client says, I just want to quickly compare headers, for instance. We also have scenarios where people are coming from other programming languages, Go, Swift, and so on, and the APIs that those languages expose for string inspection and manipulation look different enough from the .NET string inspection and manipulation APIs, where we've received feedback that people are having difficulty porting their code over. Some of the other benefits that we would want from this is...
Can I step back on that one?
Yeah,
so
go for it.
does it mean that are they used to UTF-8, or why is that what you just said tied to UTF-8?
So
that's what I don't understand.
Okay, so the answer to that is twofold. There are some developers, especially developers coming from Go, who really do expect strings to be in UTF-8. And they expect everything to be in terms of bytes, really. They expect to be able to take UTF-8 string data and be able to blit it into whatever data structure they want to for things like serialization and deserialization. Separately, there are developers for Go and Swift and other languages who want to do inspection of strings beyond what .NET allows right now. For example, right now, the .NET framework has a concept of you can enumerate UTF-16 strings by system.char. So you get a char back, a char back, a char back. However, if you have text that represents an emoji character, as an example, that emoji will actually consist of two different chars, a surrogate pair, a high surrogate followed by a low surrogate. And kind of the simple way of inspecting and manipulating strings, because you're just doing char by char by char, you'll end up kind of corrupting the data as you're processing it. Like you'll end up you'll end up taking the emoji that came in and kind of turning it into like a black diamond with an inscribed question mark, for instance. Whereas if you're following the APIs that Go and Swift just naturally give developers for string manipulation, they'll never run into that issue because those APIs naturally expose Unicode scalar values as opposed to 16-bit byte characters. So that's kind of like a twofold answer.
So if I understand right, reading this, you're not exposing a direct indexer, but Go and Swift,
Correct.
You mentioned, have native UTF-8 types for strings. Do they allow indexing?
So Swift does not have a native type for UTF-8. Actually, Emo, can you pull up that link at the top of the proposal? And if people are interested, like this is really the document I'm going through. So to what Swift does, Swift has a string type that they allow multiple different views into. So what the string is actually backed by is kind of out of your control and not really your concern, to be honest. Instead, they have string.utf8, .utf16, .utf32, and those are enumerable so that you can start retrieving scalar values from those instances.
So they have an opaque type.
They have a, yeah. There's not a direct indexer on their string types. Like you can do it if you're really clever, but it's not something that's really exposed as a first-class citizen in their API surface. Continuing to go down the list, We also have scenarios for maybe application developers just have a lot of strings inside their application, and they want to save memory because most of their strings are ASCII. And they say, you know what, we're using UTF-8, which is a language of the web. Most of the text that we have is primarily Latin characters, so let's just go ahead and see if we can get the memory savings from having our strings be effectively half the memory that they are today. Again, the document goes through a lot more of this. There are scenarios for going back to the networking example. Like if I have a byte array or a read-only memory or something that represents UTF-8 text data, can I cheaply slice it so that I don't have to keep reallocating for every single substring? Stuff along those lines.
One additional thing about the benefits of UTF-8 in networking is that you don't have issues with endianness, you
Yes.
don't have issues with alignment. Basically, the bytes are always the same, no matter on which machine, which is important in networking.
And that's a consequence of UTF-8's representation being 8-bit code units. So I should also give some definitions, terms that you'll hear me use throughout this.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned more compact memory representation,
Yes.
and I know I've seen stats, and I believe it that like often the heap is at least 10% strings. But my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is this is not expected or intended to replace most of those strings. Right? The vast majority of APIs take strings, return strings, and will not interoperate with this. And so most apps, when I break into them, I'll see 10% still strings.
So yes and no. We are going through the existing API surface that consumes strings, and we're considering what APIs it would make sense to add overloads that would also consume UTF-8 strings or read-only memory or read-only span.
But the possibility of trying to run control of the runtime language and the APIs to obfuscate the backing of string and allow existing that's being decisively eliminated.
Yeah, that's a non-goal for this.
But I would say obfuscating is a non-goal, I agree. But I would say I would like to end up in a world where the getting started with C# guide still doesn't talk about UTF-8. Like
Right.
C# has one main string, and like if you're just getting started learning the language, it should be system string.
Yes, I
I
agree.
would say the only I would amend to that, like anything that's like showing like a microservice or like a cloud programming scenario should be using UTF-8 string everywhere. Right? Do you agree?
Potentially.
Sure, but that one is already not like a
So just to clarify,
introduction to .NET.
your non-goal, it's also a non-goal to, it's not envisioned ever that an API that takes string today could potentially be passed UTF-8 string with some compiler cleverness to make sure it's not going into opt or something like that.
Correct. Like there is a tiny amount of compiler cleverness we're considering, but that mainly involves literal strings and not runtime conversion of arbitrary strings to UTF-8 strings or back. Actually, do you mind just scrolling down to the bottom of this document? There's a bulleted list with a bunch of links. It's really close to the bottom. There it is. So I just want to go over some very quick terms that people are going to hear me use throughout this conversation. The first is code unit. And when I say code unit, effectively what I'm meaning is a byte or a char, depending on if we're talking about UTF-8 or UTF-16. But code units tend to be distinct from byte or short or something like that. For example, the code unit of a UTF-16 string is system.char, which is a 16-bit integer type distinct from system.short and system.ushort, or in 16 and 30, in 16.
Just to clarify,
yeah.
is that something that you define in kind of in theory, or is that something that we will propose as types as well?
We have a char8 type proposed, which is the 8-bit code unit type of a UTF-8 string, where char8 is a distinct integer type from byte and sbyte. And the reason for this is when you have if you have a sequence of short, that is distinct conceptually from a sequence of char, which is intended to be treated as a 16-bit or a UTF-16 substring. Similarly, a sequence of byte generally represents binary data, where a sequence of char8 generally represents textual substrings of UTF-8 data.
Well, but I think if not for the issue with extension methods, we would not add this type. So the reason is not that we wanted to have a distinct type. The issue is we wanted to use memory of char8 as a representation of a string slice, and then have extension methods on memory of char8 that are text-like.
Yeah.
Versus if we use memory of byte, well, we couldn't add,
We would pollute that.
it would pollute every single memory of
Yep.
byte.
So let me keep going through the definitions real fast. So code nougat I just went over. A code point is a Unicode value that can have a representation across various different UTFs. Not every code point is representable in every UTF. For example, UTF-16 has a concept of surrogate code points, where two surrogates side by side can represent an emoji, where an emoji is a value that can't be represented as a single 16-bit integer. You can't take a UTF-16 code point and represent it as UTF-8 or UTF-32. That would be an invalid encoding.
Is this the mapping to what Miguel and Go call a rune?
Yes and no. What the rune in Go conceptually represents a scalar value, but because rune is just int in Go, it can really represent any arbitrary integer. But conceptually, they want to map runes to scalar values. When you're enumerating over a string in Go, which has UTF-8 strings, you're never going to get back a surrogate rune, because you just can't read surrogates from UTF-8. It's nonsensical.
And if I want to uniquely identify a Unicode character, such as when I look in a Unicode table, am I getting a scalar value or a code point?
So the Unicode specification has 4 different definitions for character.
Okay, maybe we'll pick that up.
When you, if you're considering a character in the sense that this is a single fundamental thing that can be represented in any UTF,
Yep.
what you're talking about is a scalar value. And that's something that you can go look up in a Unicode table and say, please get me my category. Or please take this scalar value and give me the UTF-8 representation, give me the UTF-32 representation. And those lookups and those transcodings will never fail on scalar values, because every single one of them has a well-defined transcoding behavior. So I just went over scalars, basically. Scalars are code points minus surrogates. Finally, there's grapheme, which kind of a loose definition, but a grapheme, think of it as what actually appears on your screen as the representation of a character. A grapheme can consist of multiple different scalars back to back. For example, an A with an accent grave on it could be a single accented A scalar value. There is a Unicode value for that. Or it could be a regular Latin A with a joiner with another value immediately after it that says, take the previous character and just put an accent grave on it. I don't care what it was. So both of those, either the standalone A or the sequence of 3 different scalars that I just described, can be considered as graphemes. In layman's terms, a grapheme is, if I hit the backspace key in my text editor, what do I actually expect to be deleted?
But I think also that this is a bit simplified thing, because I read a quite extensive document, very well written, I can forward, about this whole space of graphemes. And people were saying, the person was saying, well, that's true for like Latin languages and scripts.
Yeah.
In like Arabic script, this gets so complicated because it's like you don't even like
there are multiple technical specifications for this. So by the way, like we don't have a first-class concept of a grapheme in what I'm going to be presenting today. The .NET framework does have something called a text info element, I believe, but I'm not quite sure how many people are using it in practice, and my understanding is that it doesn't support the full range of things that people actually want to do with this concept. So that said, like there's the baseline for everything. With that said, I think we're actually set to go to the API.
Before we move on to the API, I think
Yes.
I want to make a couple of clarifications here, and I think this is a fantastic job. Thank you, Levi, for Levi. A couple of things.
We call you Levy.
Yeah,
We can totally do it. What's up? Go ahead.
Go does define, they arbitrarily make the definition that a rune is a code point. And what they do is that they allow invalid data to be stored in the run type, which is just an alias to an int32. But they do support an API that you're supposed to call when you expect invalid data to come in. It's called where you essentially determine whether the run is valid. So that is if the values stored in the integer belong to the range of correct encodable values in Unicode. The second thing is just a little bit of a clarification. The grapheme, well, I think that your explanation of it's something that is visible on the screen is, it's a good first pass. It is an internal representation that is actually disconnected from the UI, and the complexity that Christoph was talking about happens at a higher level. So it happens with the composition of graphemes and how those are displayed on the screen. And there's a whole algorithm for choosing the actual, bits to paint on the screen. And those are typically called glyphs. And a single letter, the letter A, for example, can have multiple glyphs in Arabic. That's one example. But in English as well, you have combinations of letters like FL or FF, which is different glyphs depending on whether you use kerning or not. So this kind of stays at the, at the compiler level, language level kind of thing, not at the display thing. And I think that the last thing that is worth discussing is that the concept of grapheme, the grapheme cluster that you have there, Swift calls this thing a character.
Yes.
So the Swift character is one of these beasts, and it's a heavier beast than a code point, right?
Oh yes, absolutely.
It's like an 8-byte or 12-byte structure.
Yeah, and part of that is due to the fact that Swift historically has been used for UI programming. Like, imagine a typical Swift application, right? It's going to be running on a mobile device historically.
So you mentioned in this document that in this specification or this proposal is not going to include support for glyphs or graphemes.
It's not something that's being
have
considered.
plans to basically kind of keep going. Like after we're done with this, is it important for us to have a very first-class good support for this space?
So there is an active discussion in CoreFX Lab regarding this, and part of the work we're doing here is to set up a foundation that such a thing can be built on top of in the future, whether that's first-party inbox support or some third-party library that someone brings on top of it. Like,
do you know what the VS Text Editor does? Because it supports all these things and it's totally managed. Is it TextInfo or?
I do not know what the text editor does. I would be surprised if they even supported that as a concept. It's just not something you see in code all that often.
So you've noted here why we're not just like adding extension methods to read-only span a byte and introducing char8. What I'm thinking though is like conceptually for the vast majority of people who don't think about the complexities of emojis and everything, a char is a letter. There's like one single concept and char is one name for that.
Yes.
And a char8 is a less reliable,
Much less reliable.
mapping to that one single concept they think they have and mostly have. A char8 very often won't be something that's useful in and of itself.
Correct.
And I wonder if the
ASCII
word
data,
char is going to lead people down that wrong path.
Right, and part of the feedback that we got today is that char today leads people down a wrong path. Now, that path happens to be correct most of the time because...
By most, we mean 99.99%.
Yeah. Like the
But
vast
this
majority
actually
of the time,
works. Like if something doesn't work, 60% of the time, the computer will let you know very quickly. If something works 99% of the time, you have bugs, software that you don't even know about.
It's true. But
Yeah, so let's go over the API then. Now that my browser has decided to crash on me, there we go. So where do we start then? In this proposal, we have UTF-8 string as an immutable reference type, very similar in concept to how system.string works. And the reason that this was done, I will send out a document later, just kind of contrasting whether it makes sense for this to be a reference type or a stack-based type. But the gist behind why I chose an immutable reference type is it is the most familiar thing and most approachable thing for the majority of our developer audience. And anything that can be built on anything that can be built on top of this could also use read-only memory or read-only span as a representation. That is, any APIs that we add for UTF-8 string processing, we would also add to the respective memory or span-based types. Because again, you might have those scenarios where you have a stack allocated buffer that you want to treat as UTF-8 text so that you can inspect or manipulate it. So as we're going through this API surface, be mindful of many of the same methods will exist as extension methods. We're just not ready to review the type that contains as extension methods yet.
So can I just rephrase it?
And so on top of that, Morning, I'd just like to clarify as well that I think at least I and maybe some other folks are still questioning that top level decision. So we can review this, under the hypothesis that we are going to move forward with this as a class, but I'm not convinced that's a given.
And perhaps I misunderstood something.
And I want to just echo Stephen's position,
Right.
because I also like Stephen's proposal a lot more than this one.
Did you say that all of these you expected to add extension methods on read-only standard, right?
I expect there to be conceptually equivalent extension methods, but the signatures will look different in some cases.
I was just trying to understand how that mapped to the earlier comment you made about that's why you didn't want to overload read-only.
Yes.
Yes.
So for example, we'll go over a two-upper invariant method on this type. That method as an extension method on span would look completely different. Okay.
It'll be a span on chart.
Maybe to try.
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
span on
yeah.
byte.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But to Miguel's and Stephen's point, so like
Yeah.
I'm taking notes. So I mean, I already wrote down that we still decide whether it's an immutable reference type
Yeah.
or
If it's a
a
class
failure
or a string.
type or whatever. Right? The other question is like, what are the two types that you're introducing? It's UTF-8 string as a high-level thing, and then char8, right? These
So
are the two major-
today what we're going over is three types: UTF-8 string,
Yep.
char8, which I don't actually have in this proposal,
Okay.
but an integer type with comparison operators that's 8 bits wide,
Right.
um,
More equivalent
and
to char.
Unicode scalar. Those are the three things we're
Right.
going over today.
Without segment type, that's not in here.
Segment type is not in here.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
part-
segment type is memory of
Yeah.
char8.
And so the extension methods we're not going over.
is part of the char8 proposal, though, the idea that it would have this same type hunting as byte and S byte, or is that separate?
That is TBD.
Okay.
Because I don't think it affects the public API surface.
But yes.
So anyway, the one thing that I wanted to I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. One thing that you'll notice as you look at the types constructors is that all of the constructors at the top of the API are validating constructors. What that means is that as we're copying string data over, like as we're copying data into a UTF-8 string type, while we copy, we also check to make sure that it is in fact valid UTF-8. And if we see invalid UTF-8, we fix it up by replacing bad bytes on the fly. The replacement character is the regular Unicode replacement character, FFFD. Most people see this as a black diamond with an inscribed question mark.
What if I don't want the replacement? I want you to actually tell me fail.
So there are APIs for that. I just don't have those APIs on here, so that's actually something I should take as an action item.
So one of the reasons
Yeah.
you brought up that we didn't want to discuss type hunting because it wouldn't affect the API.
Mhm.
Your second set of constructors are exactly where it would affect the API. You wouldn't need the char8 overload, or you wouldn't want the byte one or the char8 one because they would implicitly convert between each other, correct?
So we've received feedback that not all languages have this concept of implicit conversion between the two, and that for discoverability reasons we might want to add overloads that correspond to things that you can already do just by casting.
Well,
Like we discussed that a few weeks ago
but-
with other types.
But I think, so the issue was slightly different. Not that I'm pushing back, but
Yeah,
the issue was that we don't want to have a method that takes read-only span of char, let's say,
Yes.
and not have a method that takes a string. Because
Right.
in languages that don't automatically convert, you cannot just pass a string literal.
Yeah.
In C# you can, and in other languages you cannot.
So
This is a very advanced conversion between char8 and byte, and I think
Yeah.
it may be worth discussing. with
Okay,
you.
and that's fine, and we can absolutely eliminate some of those overloads if it would make sense to do so.
Having said that, the cost of having
Yeah.
this additional overload is low, and it makes it super crisp.
So I have go for it.
Coming back to, you said that we're gonna overwrite incorrect, sequences or characters or
Yes.
bytes in there. Are we gonna really change the underlying buffers? What if it's built on top of read-only span and that type of stuff?
So
View that.
because UTF-8 string has its own copy of the data that's passed to it,
Okay.
we fix things up as we're copying the data. This is copying the data on allocation is similar to the way that strings work in pretty much every other language that we looked at: Go, Swift, Python, C++, Java. So yeah,
So we copy on
we would copy.
Fair enough.
I think all those other places that follow the Unicode specification, they're doing the same sort of thing. They're replacing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I'm
not
not questioning that, I'm
Yeah.
asking. So.
Yeah.
So this is
More data.
different than how some languages work. For example, Go does not validate when it copies from a byte array. They just do a simple mem copy. We do a replacement, and the reason for that is historically, UTF-8 text processing has been a treasure trove of security vulnerabilities in web-based applications. Those vulnerabilities tend to arise when developers take byte data, treat it as if it were UTF-8, and then try to act on it. For instance, sending it straight to the database and persisting it inside of a primary key column, or trying to create a file with that name, or trying to create two different users in the membership database that both have names that are perversions of one another, in the sense that they're invalid UTF-8 data. And if you go to like cve.miter.org and just type UTF-8, you'll find well over 100 vulnerabilities in various frameworks resulting from this.
Having said that, the implication is.
I did go to the CVE and I did
Yes.
look at this, and I think that this is that you're painting that situation with a very thick brush in terms of that.
Yes.
I think that some of these exploitable things are things that are exploitable from C to begin with. I would be interested. I mean, I didn't look at the time; it just occurs to me, but I don't recall seeing any exploits that were rooted in Go's handling of the same UTF-8 data. So I think that yes, it might have been UTF-8, but it was in C code. It was not in Go.
You also have to consider the ecosystem with which .NET applications are going to exist. Like if we're interfacing with databases that just take random bytes as their primary key column, they just say these bytes represent text data. One could make the argument, and I am making somewhat of that argument here, that it's on us to make sure that our application developers aren't getting into a bad situation when they're trying to interface with databases that have this concept.
I think that you're conflating those things, and I don't know why your ecosystem would be vastly different than the existing Go ecosystem that would deal with these things. But I'm assuming that if I'm talking to a database, some amount of marshalling would take place, and if there is an invalid character at that point, the marshalling would stop marshalling at that point because it cannot proceed.
So
Lisa,
marshalling doesn't exist though in this scenario. Keep in mind one of the reasons for having a UTF-8 string type is that you can literally reinterpret cast the data as binary and just send it straight across the wire.
I have two proposals. One is, I think it would be good for you to somewhere describe or send to the group a concrete example of an exploit. So
it is
people
in
can
this
address-
document.
Okay,
This
if it's
document
in
includes one.
Because like you've been talking about saving to database, but then people are like,
This
so
doc-
what?
like,
I
we
saved
will
a
go
byte
over it.
array to.
Let's keep
integrate.
going.
Second thing is the implication of what you just said. The fact that this type copies data on construction and does validation. It means it's not meeting requirements of the scenario number one.
So
the fast web server parsing data in buffers.
That particular scenario as I described, is going to have some kind of memory or span-based representation.
Yeah.
And we're not going over the APIs for that as part of this.
Just wanted to make
As part
it
of
so
this,
people
yeah.
realize that basically this type that we are reviewing today
Mhm.
is not for the scenario number one.
There will be variants
It's
basically, which
more
will be
for-
for high performance servers.
Correct.
Yeah,
That's what
it's
we say.
more for basically the
Convenience.
Miguel's scenarios
yeah.
and ML, I think,
Yes.
maybe to some extent, parsers that Ason is writing,
This is a
but
type
not
that
for
we,
the,
Is it for parsers though?
well.
this is a type
so-
that we expect to be presented back to users, for
It's,
example,
the
return
return
from
one.
API service.
I'm super worried about that.
Yeah,
Then what do we expose for headers? Is it strings that are always going to be copied, or
No, the scenario, in my opinion, the API is, it gives you a span.
Yep.
And you inspect it. If you want to store it for later, you call to UTF-8 string, and then we return this one.
the ecosystem?
So it's
of
basically
APIs?
for saving the data for later.
So that's fine. The only issue is when people design APIs that have to consume something UTF-8, they have to now pick, right?
No.
Or do multiple. Yeah.
Because there's some polymorphic relationship between these types, and you return the most powerful one, and you take the
It's like how our
least
APIs
powerful,
would
the
take,
most
yeah.
flexible one.
So some of our APIs take read-only span of char, and they can consume string, like it just works, right?
To be fair,
So
though, like,
if-
I mean,
if
his
I run a
point is still
parser-
valid.
If
You
I
have
run a
to choose.
parser over routes, right?
Yeah.
I want to take the path and turn it into a route table. What does that take? Span of char 8,
If you want to,
span of byte.
yeah. So if it's an
UTF-8
input
string.
parameter,
Yep.
I would say, does span of char work for you? If does,
Depends on what
take
we
it,
expose.
because it's the most flexible, I mean, the most generic one.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, because for example, you want to store it for later, then take memory of char 8. And there's not many reasons to take this type, because this will be convertible to memory of char 8 without any allocations.
Yeah. Imagine this as an exchange type that flows through application or user code. The APIs on here can actually give you performance gains over the APIs that would exist as extension methods on memory or span. But I mean, that could be a separate concern.
I also think that's unlikely to happen.
So, for example,
What you're going to say? You're going to say the validation because of tearing and things like that,
no,
right?
not that. For example, say that you want to compare two things for equality, a UTF-8 string and a string instance. Comparing those for ordinal equality, if you're using regular reference types, is actually very, very fast. Whereas if you're using, if you're doing it with span or memory of T, you have to fall back to a somewhat slower code path because you have to perform a transcoding step.
Why?
So as part of construction of UTF-8 string, we're also able to determine if you contain all ASCII data, for instance, and we're able to make optimizations based on that.
Sure.
Are we red holing too much on this design point? Should we just take the design point that we currently have and just move on? Because I think there seems to be some contention on whether we want a type that copies, right? And I think we can note that and then, well, let's move on.
So I will say that every language that I've studied that has a concept of this does copy by default in order to present a more usable type to application developers.
Right.
But I still wonder why we keep having questions whether we want a type that copies. Because we have a list of scenarios, and we need to have a type that people can store
we
for
do have
later.
to have
Like
a
a
copy.
parser returns initially, let's say, span of char 8,
Yep.
but at some point the user says like, yeah, this is the value that I was looking for.
Yep.
You know, I inspected the header's name, and I now want to store the value for later. What do? We need to have an answer for it.
Yeah.
So today, the answer can be either UTF-8 string, as here on the screen,
Right.
or you pay the cost of both allocation and transcoding, and we keep using system string if you want to store the data for later, or memory of char 8. Those are our three choices.
Right.
But I think, saying like, do we need a type like this? We should kind of very quickly go back to scenarios and say, well, do we need this type for any of the scenarios? If yes, then we need the type.
Yeah, I'm not making a value statement here. What I'm trying to say is that it seems there's, like, Stephen and Miguel seem to be pushing a different direction than what you just described. All I'm saying is
And
that...
I'm trying very hard not to argue in this meeting, like argue that point in this meeting.
We should
Leave that for later.
keep going through this though,
Right.
because we are at risk of not getting through this. To one of the questions that came up in chat is what about things like byte order marks? Imagine there's no such thing as a byte order mark. Like byte order mark is a concept of like document storage.
Right.
UTF-8 string and string don't deal in that. So moving on, so we went over constructors, comparison, oh yeah, sorry, was there someone on the call?
Just typing.
Just typing, okay. So any comparison API, compares to equality, stuff like that, anything that does not take a compare info or a string comparison or something along those lines, we assume ordinal. This generally matches how system string works today. Some APIs on system string like .equals use ordinal by default unless you specify an explicit comparison. Some APIs on system string like compare to use thread current culture by default unless you specify an explicit comparison. This has led to a few problems with developers not really knowing how string is going to treat data. So we are willing to take a small break from string here and say, within the UTF-8 string type, we're willing to be self-consistent and say ordinal by default. If you pass an explicit comparison, we will honor what you passed in. We also have certain helper types, or certain helper APIs, compare ordinal equals ordinal, that just prevent you from having to explicitly specify a string comparison. It's just a little bit more compact way of writing this. Any questions on that? I thought this might actually be a point of contention.
So the only question I have to compare to is ordinal as well.
Compare to is ordinal, yes.
So in compare you have the ordinal as suffix, so that's kind of a little bit inconsistent. So are we gonna put the ordinal suffix in everything? Maybe it's red holding already, but yeah.
So the compare to method does not have the ordinal suffix because it implements the IComparable interface.
It has to be.
But then, no, the question
Well,
is,
you
do
could
we
always implement it
compare
explicitly if you wanted to and have a different public one.
And we could do that, and maybe we say that that's our solution.
Right.
Did you say compare was ordinal by default?
Yes, everything is ordinal by default
The
unless it
default
takes a
overloads.
string comparison.
Why is there a compare ordinal and a compare that the default is ordinal?
There's
No
compare ordinal is just like a simple utility API where it's less typing to do it.
Why wouldn't that one just be compare if everything's ordinal by default?
Exactly.
Like a compare overload without the comparison type.
Sorry, there were two people talking at once. To Jeremy's point first, compare and compare ordinal should be static. That's a mistake on my part.
Right.
What was the second question?
The second question was, if everything's ordinal by default, why does that second overload even need to say ordinal in it?
Or why does it have to exist?
Because
One-
it's static.
It's static.
And what's
One
the
of-
value of it?
One
being
of the
static?
things that we said when we were designing this type is if an API can take a string comparison, we should not have an overload that does not take a string comparison because we want the call site to be very explicit in what they want. The only time where we should ever say ordinal by default without taking a string comparison is if we require it in order to override a method like equals or get hash code or implement a method like IComparable.compare to.
Why do you want people to be explicit about the compare if ordinal is kind of a natural choice?
Because this has been a pain point for people using system.string, and we wanted to try to get developers in the habit of being
To
clear.
be fair though, like,
at
I
the
would
call
argue
site.
that's the string being fucked up because string does equality with ordinal, but does comparisons with culture sensitivity. If this type is consistently ordinal, I don't see the problem.
It's consistently ordinal, but now you have a case where people might have code paths where they have string and now they're converting them to UTF-8 string.
Right.
And now the behavior changes in
And
unexpected
they get
ways.
subtle bugs.
Yeah.
I like.
Yeah, but
ordinal
that's gonna be
being-
the behavior as well. Like if you're treating this through the interface,
Yes.
or it seems inconsistent in a sense to suffix some of them and not others. And because we can't suffix them all, I'm not sure why we'd suffix any.
Well, the suffix is only for static methods, and that matches what's on system string today.
Right. I mean, like, I think the biggest argument String in has favor of compare compare ordinal ordinal is that it exists in string.
That's right.
But I think I think the argument is still valid to say if you have a compare that takes 3 arguments, it's natural. It's more natural, I would argue, to have a compare that takes only 2 arguments and then it implies ordinal, like the rest of the type does already.
So maybe I misunderstood this. I said, like, if you scroll down for the like starts with or ends with kind of methods, to those are those not suffixed with ordinal?
Starts with and ends with. The only ones that don't take a comparison, I believe, are ones that operate on raw scalars. Yeah.
So we don't have any methods that are implying ordinal
Correct.
besides equality.
The only methods that imply ordinal are compare to, equals, and get hash code. And that's because I couldn't change the signature.
I still don't understand why we need this method.
Which method?
Compare to
Yeah.
is an instance method,
Yes.
and it's ordinal.
Yes.
Why do we need compare ordinal static?
It's on string for consistency.
Yeah.
So the only reason is I'm porting code and I don't want to change to an instance.
Well, the
code.
biggest argument why you want a static method is so you don't have to do the null checks yourself. So whether the left argument or the right argument is null, you don't have to worry. Just call the static, pass them to it, and both are null. It's fine. If both are not null, then you call the things, right?
But I think I'm hearing that people want like a static compare that takes two parameters in addition to the one that takes 3.
Yeah, basically the
That's
question is
basically
this, I mean,
Yeah,
I think
we removed the ordinal suffix because ordinal is implied in the string.
So which is more
I'm not
important?
sure that's what I heard actually, because we
really?
said we had that on string already for porting. Maybe that's a secondary thing, but I
Which is
heard
more important, the suffix
Yeah,
or
so
the
but my
fact that
concern is
fewer
the reason it's
squiggles?
on string is because the default for compare for string is not ordinal.
Correct. However,
So
I believe
it's
string.
like having ordinal in the name here to me suggests that the default is not ordinal.
Exactly. I think it's gonna confuse people.
okay.
They will think explicitly they said ordinal, it means the other one is not.
Yeah. So we can.
They're already gonna have to read documentation to
I agree
understand
with,
it's ordinal.
with that as well.
Yeah.
It's already confusing enough, I think. I
No,
like
so-
the ordinal being explicit, honestly, because it makes it clear to me that
How
I'm seeing the code. that
So
it's
what-
ordinal.
How
was
important
the-
is that I take existing code as a string, search and replace string to UTF-8 string and have fewer squiggles?
There is a subset of applications that is going to want to do that, especially applications that have a lot of string instances that they're taking from user data. Imagine like something huge like SharePoint Online or something, right? Minimizing the pain going from one type to another will be useful for those developers.
But I think that we are not on track to have no changes. So
Correct.
think about all the APIs that used to return chars, now they return
Oh, for sure.
HRA.
And
so
if
there will
there's
be
a
changes.
straightforward-
This one
yeah.
will be such a small, addition of
Yeah.
changes that you need to make that
But it's one less paper.
if it
cut.
was like we can make it 100% compatible. Okay, well then maybe the value of keeping the ordinal is high enough. But this is just a
I would-
an iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, I would be willing to eliminate this, right? Like, if you try converting your code and you get a squiggle, you're going to look to see, oh, what parameters does this method take, and you're going to know pretty quickly how to fix it, right? It's not a huge pain point.
Why don't we set a string compressor to our default ordinal value and not have 4 methods?
How do you perform a lexical comparison? Do we just not support it?
Or isn't there a value string compressor that is ordinal?
Yes.
So what if we set that as the default value of the compressor type?
Oh, so you're saying actually have this as a default parameter?
Yeah.
What's
That's
our
what
feeling on that, by the
Steven
way?
and Miguel as well. Yeah.
Like I was
I
always
think
under
that's
the
fine.
impression that we tried to avoid that in API reviews, default parameters.
But I think we changed our mind.
We're allowing it for new APIs.
We're allowing it?
Yes.
Doesn't the GDP
That's what happens with Roslyn
Yeah.
API.
It would be, it's an enum.
Oh, the
Yeah,
enum,
yeah,
not
Yeah,
the culture.
the enum will be ordinal.
Okay.
Or just have the compare overload that takes 2 parameters as
Yeah,
well.
we could, I mean, if
That's-
the,
I think
yeah.
We've been adding them.
If the consensus is overload versus default parameter, like either seem perfectly legitimate to me.
what is nice about default arguments is that you literally convey the fact that the
Right.
default is it.
Exactly.
Like you see it in the signature. Otherwise, you have to read the docs.
And less APIs.
That's also true.
Okay, so the feedback on that is kill compare ordinal, default string comparison.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the strategy for comparing against string, cross contamination between UTF-8 and string here? You got to convert between the two to then do
So
comparisons?
there is an equality comparison between string and UTF-8 string. There is no compare to comparison.
Convert.
Compare to would involve transcoding. Equality comparison is a little interesting, and I don't think I have it in this API that we're discussing today, because I'm trying to figure out how it works with the language on the compiler. For example, we're considering having the compiler smart enough to say, oh, you're trying to take a literal string and pass it to someone who expects a UTF-8 string, I can just do all of that fix-up either at compile time or at JIT time. If we have an API on UTF-8 string, like UTF-8 string dot equals string, now the literal string matches that, which means that we take the runtime transcoding hit, where if we were able to do that at compile time, things would have been a lot faster. So it's just something we're working through. Okay.
Why isn't empty a constant? Sorry, I missed that.
Sorry?
Why not have empty be a constant?
This was for matching what system string does. I believe the JIT might
System
require
string
it
is
to be
wrong.
non-constant.
Okay.
I-
System string is wrong.
Is it and someone from the JIT team might have to inform the decision here, but I was under the impression that having empty as a constant meant that it was difficult to intern empty strings across applications, which meant that like string reference equal ended up being weird. That's my historical understanding of this.
Okay.
I mean, right now we
We'll
can
do
make
whatever
it because we don't
Andy
have the language that treats it as literal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, right now we can because we don't have the language that we consider it as a literal, right? But I mean, once it is, we could make the cons, yeah. Right now we wouldn't be able to, right?
Yeah, but we should think about this assuming that we have a language.
Right. All I'm saying is that, you know.
Yeah, my understanding is that for string, it was some weird artifact of how interning and other things work.
The length obviously
Yeah.
doesn't include null, but it makes me just, perhaps you already covered this, these will include null typically?
No,
So the-
just
never-
like string, it's the number of characters that exist in the like.
No, I know
byte
that's
array
what
or
length
whatever.
is. I mean,
Yeah.
the backing storage is if I need to
Oh
pass
yeah,
this
yeah.
to something
The
that takes.
for an immutable reference type UTF-8 string, it is null terminated, guaranteed. And the reason for that is we may as well, if we're already doing the memcopy, just to make the invokes faster.
Right.
So now,
It also makes some of our own logic faster too.
at the risk of spending next hour,
Yeah.
Oh god, Crystal's getting us in trouble.
scalar sequence, rune sequence, scalars. Should we discuss it now?
So which part? Oh, the naming of scalars?
Let's go through the non-contentious stuff first.
Yeah.
We're gonna have more than one.
We have
Yeah.
non-contentious stuff here.
Things like
Okay.
things like starts with might be non-contentious, right?
Okay, sounds good.
You want to cover concat first? I mean,
Yeah, let's cover concat, which
Let's
is
get
going to be
some
contentious.
I had a question about length. So if you construct it from a read-only span of
Yeah.
byte and you do a replacement in this,
Yep.
now the lengths are going to be different.
The length will be different, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. The length will be different between what?
If you pass into the constructor a read-only span of byte that contains garbage data, and we do all of the fix-ups in the constructor, the length that you get back will be different than the length that you passed in. Similarly, with system string today, if you call its constructor passing in an S byte array or whatever it takes, the length of that S byte array is going to be different than the length of the resulting system string.
Could be.
It will, for system string, it almost certainly will be different. But yeah.
For system string, it'd be different, but why would it be different for UTF-8 string? Do you not
Because-
do like a one-to-one replacement of the surrogate pairs?
Replacement
No, replacement character is 3 bytes long, and
Oh.
we might be replacing an arbitrary number of bytes in the input. So replacement can grow strings, it can shrink strings. So until we actually inspect, we don't know how it's going to affect the length. So concat.
yes.
Maybe this was a bad example of a non-contentious API. The reason for this is string.concat is actually special cased by the compiler today, and that's how the operator plus is implemented. In fact, the compiler goes a little further and says if you have literal plus literal plus literal, like I'm just going to say screw it, all three of them combined are a single literal, because you're never going to observe them as separate instances. We would need to figure out how that works here on UTF-8 string, because we're going to be discussing over the next few weeks compiler support. I believe the final API will probably look something like this, but we also have to consider how the existence of types like value, struct string builder, and stuff like that would play into this. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Are you going to cover the idea that the other thing we should talk about with strings is like interpolation?
Mhm.
So with Unicode strings,
I don't have string formatting here. That is I have that set up for another review, but like string.format effectively is not part of this review.
Right, the string.format is not how the compiler implements interpolation.
How do you implement interpolation?
We use like formattable string.
Formatable string, right.
Right, so we need like formatable UTF-8 string.
Perhaps
Well,
this
Jared,
was,
don't you do use string.format unless you're targeting a formatable string. If you're targeting a string, you still use string format,
It's a
right?
combination, yeah.
I think it's a combination.
Yeah.
I'd have to look it up, but I know we have a pair type we use for some formatting.
Yeah, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to try to have that discussion and how do we do formatting in general, like under the same umbrella.
But
because they're
could
related.
we put it in notes to not
Yeah,
forget?
absolutely. Like some stuff that's missing, we
formatting.
should. We should.
So I have a question about the concat and compiler support.
Yeah, what's up?
So with the 3 new members that you added, that they read only span of char,
Yeah.
they are very general purpose because everything is convertible to read only span of char. Therefore, we don't need the 5 methods above. That's my assertion.
Well, you would still need the enumerable and the params if you wanted to support things other than 2, 3, or 4 arguments.
Yeah.
Well, so I would say no, and the reason is the following.
Yeah.
We will want to be able to concatenate both UTF-8 string and slices, several different types. So this API was designed when we just had string. The moment you have many types, you kind of have to use something like a string for concatenation, because we're not gonna have 5,000 permutations of all these 3 types that we want to concatenate.
There are 3 reasons that we might want to have overloads to take UTF-8 string explicitly. The first is discoverability. Like if I have UTF-8 strings that I'm concatenating, like it's just natural for me to call the plus operator or for me to do UTF-8 string.concat.
Should I comment as you go on the reasons?
Wait till I
The
get
first one.
Okay. So it's actually 2 reasons, not 3.
Okay. 2 I can remember.
Yeah, the second, so that's the first one, discoverability. The second one is concat that takes UTF-8 string actually suppresses validation.
Validation
of input. It doesn't fix up FFFD at runtime.
And why?
Because we either know if each component of the input is valid or not, which means that we can set the flag on the result appropriately in O of one time.
Yeah. But okay, so let me talk to both of these issues. The discoverability, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It basically lets people on the path to discover these methods, and when they concatenate UTF-8 string instances, it all works and they are happy. And then they discover that they have memory of char8 or one of the slices, and they're like, okay, what do I do now? And they are lost. Versus not having this API would make it, very clear how you concatenate. It kind of, the other 3 members always work, and the string builder needs to be used if you have too many of these to concatenate. So that's, I don't feel like it's not a showstopper. I would not say over my dead body.
Yeah.
But this is something to consider.
It's a legitimate concern.
About the validation, I don't understand why you cannot do the same skip validation thing
on read-only spam.
No. On the value builder.
Yeah.
Would have overloads append UTF-8 string, and if it takes you UTF-8 string, you can skip the validation.
That we could do that. That would require making that string builder cognizant of how we store that information in UTF-8 string. Like we could consider it.
Okay. So I would basically almost say like we will have to have the builder because these APIs just don't scale to all the scenarios that we want. The moment we have a builder, then your argument about the check and like
discoverability, stuff like that. Like if the builder would be used by the compiler as we're just writing A plus B plus C plus D blah blah blah, like then we just get goodness.
But you say if, I'm saying the compiler has no other choice. People will write span plus string plus memory. Well, the compiler has no choice. They cannot use these overloads.
Yeah.
Well, if they have more.
Span plus string plus memory would 2-string both sides, and Because that's what plus is
Well,
defined
by
to by the
string, I
language.
meant UTF-8 string.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I mean,
strictly
it gets
speaking,
weird.
you
It gets
could,
weird.
you-
The same.
I mean, you
gotta
could
be
have,
careful what
yeah.
string is in a
But
plus.
even
It's-
even system strings, so the UTF-8 builder could do transcoding on the fly. So if you
Yeah.
have components and they are different encodings, it could do like the compiler could be
Yeah.
smart. Choose the most common encoding, use the string builder and transcode just one segment on the fly.
Yeah, we need to be a little careful there because we don't want to run into a situation where developers inadvertently do runtime transcoding of stuff that really should have been compile time transcoding.
Hey, and maybe, I mean, if I look at what Go does, Go just concatenates the underlying byte arrays,
Mhm.
even
Yeah.
if there's invalid data.
Yeah, and we do too.
If it's in the validated type.
No, concat of read-only span would just say I'm unvalidated, basically.
So, Miguel, the flag that Levi was talking about was if you happen to concatenate 5 strings and they were all with this, unvalidated flag set,
Yeah.
then the resulting string has the flag set.
Yes.
If you concatenate 4 strings that are validated and one not, the result is not validated.
Yeah, there's no.
It's just an optimization.
There's no
It's-
extra
yeah.
overhead there. We mark the result as we haven't performed validation yet. That's all.
So when does someone care if it's validated?
Generally, what we do is we try validating at construction time because we assume that the common use case is going to be somebody calling .as bytes and just copying it somewhere.
Yeah.
So we never really have an opportunity aside from the constructor to do validation.
But if concat
So
isn't validating, then when do I find out that the string isn't valid?
hand wave. It's one of the consequences of using read-only span, basically. Like read-only span. What I want to do is I want to get developers into the habit of treating spans of char 8 as if they were valid, because ideally you don't even get an instance of that without having performed validation in the first place. I realize that's a very poor answer, and that's a long way of saying I don't have a good answer for it.
Shouldn't we have a method hanging out of this that's like an is valid or validate type method?
We don't have one off of string.
Shouldn't we?
We could. I have that API on a type that's not being considered here.
Okay.
I think it would be super useful API, both for UTF-16 and UTF-8 string.
But your feedback is that you need that basically, right? Or you
it's
want
like-
I don't want people to get in the habit of calling that because A, I don't think people will, and B, for the majority of the time, it's just going to return true.
But I think that
We wanna call it
cat and
all
the
parts of
constructor
the-
should behave the same unless it's very
Not
clear of
after.
if I ended up building my own span and copied the middle byte of a 3-byte sequence over
Yeah.
and over and over again because of a programming error, like I need to know that I've made that mistake. So if the constructor is going to tell me, concat needs to tell me, or as bytes needs to throw.
Yeah.
This is not.
So we should have
valid.
that feedback. I think Chris have had that feedback on the constructors too.
I'm just-
Initially, that
Yeah.
some cases he maybe wanted to throw rather than just
like-
replace. So
Yeah.
so basically, more feedback on the way, like either throwing or
That
validation.
does, like, to be honest, that does make me a little nervous because even though like I was a proponent of validating in the constructor, I wonder if this would be surprising to developers, if it would end up taking more time than they were expecting.
Well, again, like I think it's if you pass in 2 UTF-8 strings, if they have the I am valid, therefore you can just copy the data. But if you're passing in a sequence of char 8s, whose sequence is this? And that means that you need to validate it.
Well,
You've gone too low.
keep in mind that UTF-8 string can absolutely contain invalidated. We're not blocking it. Like there is a factory that we're actually getting to at the bottom of the screen, which says don't validate. So
yeah,
I'm just-
it's something we have to
He
consider.
wants
more.
to be able to check.
Yeah, we have to consider it more, and we can go over that offline too. What that might look like. Contains is relatively straightforward. Instead of taking char 8, we take a scalar because taking a char 8 is probably not what you wanted. Taking a byte is probably not what you wanted. We could consider compile time support so that you can say contains like single quote X single quote, and that would at compile time or at JIT time take the ASCII X character, turn it into a Unicode scalar, and do the right thing for contains.
We should definitely do this.
Yeah, like the language
Without it,
the language samples that I have assume that that's the case.
Yeah.
Just for
So
those
there's no cast from char to Unicode scalar on Unicode scalar.
There is no cast we could add one. I was imagining it would just be a compile time thing. We saw literal, we just converted it on your behalf.
Also, it would be an explicit cast, correct? Because it can fail.
It would have to be an explicit cast, yes. There's a constructor that takes it right now, but we could make it an explicit cast, that's fine.
You have a contains method that takes UTF-8 string without any string comparison.
We could make the string comparison default to ordinal, right?
Yeah.
We should do this across the board, actually.
Yeah, we can add that to string as well.
Well, if we had a default for string
Contains.
comparison, then we would remove the first
That
overload.
takes the scalar?
I think we
No,
should.
no, no,
Yeah,
that
that's
takes the,
fine.
sorry.
Oh,
It means we'll need to.
we have, I think. We don't have
we
it.
might need JIT support in order to
It's in
make
the
that
backlog, I'm
perform
sure
well,
I've seen
but
it.
we can look it up.
I'm pretty sure we added it in core, actually.
So keep in mind what I just said, like we might need some JIT support in order to make string, and if we're getting rid of the overloads that don't take a string comparison, like we would need to get the JIT to start recognizing some of these patterns and start special casing stuff. For example, inside of contains, the very first thing that we do is switch over the string comparison. If you're passing a constant string comparison, we should make the jitter smarter about ignoring the switch statement.
Could we do escape as a first check for the default?
Well,
Last path and then do switch.
Ideally, we don't want to branch at all.
So what do you want to fix in the
Theoretically, that should just be part of JIT optimization and then wait.
Yeah, but the JIT right now doesn't look at these methods aren't marked inlineable, and the JIT will not inline them by default just because of how large they are. We just need to consider we need to consider the consequences of using default parameters rather than having overloads that don't take anything at all, and what changes we might have to make to the JIT in order to have the performance guarantees we want. That's all. So it's not as simple as remove the overload and everything will work. Like it actually does change the performance characteristics without JIT changes.
But you could do it without JIT changes if changing the switch to deferring to different methods, and then the JIT does a double inline, which is I think it does. It says, oh, you have a constant here, I'm only going to call this thing, oh, that calls some other method, I'll just make it jump to that method instead of pushing two frames.
Yeah, but I can't make the first method as aggressive inlining though because I might impact branching in my column if it happens not to be a constant, like random stuff like that. Anyway.
Is there an index of?
No, there is not index of.
It's not on purpose?
Actually, there is. I take that back. We're going in alphabetical order.
I see.
Yeah,
Where I
yes.
see.
I thought you meant indexer. There is no indexer.
No.
Okay, so there's contains. Here's create. This create is very similar to the constructor, but it takes a delegate, very much like string.create.
So I don't
So
understand.
I had a question on this.
Yeah.
So am I understanding correctly that the validation that's referred to can actually change the length?
It can indeed.
So what happens? So I pass in a length here. I'm given a span to write into.
Yep.
I write into it. I fill the whole thing.
Yep.
That data that I wrote in won't actually all show up in the result necessarily.
The data that you wrote in, if we detect that it's invalid, we throw out what you did, replace it, and return the replaced value back to the user.
Okay, so that may actually allocate again.
Yeah.
It might, but if you're not passing it invalid data, which you're not doing, right, then it won't allocate again.
Are there versions of these that don't validate?
Yes, actually, Emo, scroll down.
Sorry.
Immediately after this giant comment, create without validation. And that giant comment also gives an example of a potential vulnerability that can occur if you just blindly create invalid UTF-8 strings and have the application developer consume them.
Why do we have create from bytes? Isn't create
overload
from char
resolution.
basically good enough?
What do you mean?
Sorry.
Like you basically always getting char 8, and if you have bytes, you
Call dot as
You just
kind
UTF-8.
of cast or do
You just say
whatever.
dot as. We have an as bytes method on span, don't we?
Yeah, you could absolutely do that. I thought that it would have discoverability problems, so I added these
It's just
overloads.
this
but-
API is so advanced, like all these APIs,
Yeah.
that I wouldn't worry
If we
about
have
discoverability.
discoverability problems with regards to char 8 to byte conversion, we have bigger issues.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's fair. Okay, we can kill those overloads.
So which one we want to
Create from
do?
bytes.
Create from
bytes,
bytes and create from bytes without validation. Go away.
Yeah.
I would say the main argument is this is such an advanced feature. Like people who use these APIs will know how to convert it because it will be basically David and some other person.
Okay, this will be
It should, yes.
David, Ben, and Steven.
Yes, exactly.
No, he said he doesn't want wanted char 8 everywhere that we're talking about character data. And that one says byte instead of char 8.
Yeah, that is a mistake in the signature. Thank you. My copy and paste foo is not strong. So yeah, since someone was asking for an explicit example of what can go wrong, this comment has an example of such a thing. Basically, this would allow, the scenario here is I register an account on your forum. I pass invalid data to the server forwards it to the database. Remember, there's no marshalling because the data is already bytes. It ends up in the database, and now I start posting, heinous racist messages, and admins can't delete the posts.
Why they cannot delete the post?
Because if you consider how deletion is going to work, what's going to happen is the admin portal on the web page is going to have a delete this user account link, where the user ID is going to be sent back to the server. But the user ID contains invalid UTF-8 characters, which means the web browser is going to replace them with FFFD at runtime, which means that every time you try hitting the delete this user button, the web server is going to return 404 that user doesn't exist. So now the way to fix this is to go into the database and manually nuke the rows.
Or write a different delete form that takes bytes.
That's not how web browsers work.
Well, I can write an application that does it explicitly. It's not. It has nothing to do with web browsers.
You can write an application that does that, but in practice, no one does.
Yeah, I know, but I don't think this is.
I'm confused. So you're saying that the user request through the website to submit the malicious message wasn't validated, but the admin's request to delete it was validated?
By the web browser itself, not by the server. The web browser will not let you send invalid UTF-8 to the server. Like web browsers, by and large,
people are going to be running servers that don't validate.
Yeah, that was the entire point of using span in memory and skipping validation, was it not?
Well, how did the user submit the invalid name to the server?
Because
they
I
use
don't
the
have to
browser?
use I don't have to use a web browser. I can use Fiddler instead of.
I see. You're saying because
attackers don't.
The attacker can skip the browser.
Yeah, attackers aren't
still
the same as we are.
Okay, still, I would say this is equivalent to some things are hard when people. This is not.
This is not a concern that existing application developers have to deal with in our ecosystem. It's something that we're now going to force them to deal with. That's bad.
To be fair, Ben has a good point. Like your scenario is
Yes,
not
UTF
super
string.
compelling in the sense that most people will end up using a user ID to delete like the int ID or the GUID or whatever.
You would think that.
Yes,
That's not actually all that common.
Okay.
People writing like high performance forums, like yes, they're going to use proper user IDs. There's an amazing amount of code out there that just uses a username as a user ID.
Yeah.
Or your email address as a user ID.
Pretty common, actually.
It just seems like this is the wrong level to be performing these sort of checks. I mean, I have not looked at ASP.NET Core, but ASP.NET used to have a forms validation system in place.
That is different than this. So ASP.NET, so currently .NET applications don't run into this problem.
I mean, it certainly validates something different, right, for cross-site scripting.
Yes.
But, that's what happens, that these web frameworks had to do some level of validation. And in fact, they do have to do all kinds of validation for cookies and all kinds of other things. So I don't buy this.
Did you look at the CVEs that I sent around earlier? Like there are 100 plus.
Well, there's a lot of CVEs, and like I said at the beginning of this discussion, when I looked at this a couple of months ago, or whenever you sent that thing, there were issues with the C implementation. I just happened to go there a few minutes ago, and I was specifically looking at holes in UTF-8 and Go, and I couldn't find anything that jumped at me at that point. Maybe there's some, but I haven't found it yet. I've been trying to follow this.
So since Unicode 5, I believe the specification has said that anyone who processes data, when they find invalid data, has to replace the invalid code points. Are you saying that we shouldn't have any validation on any of the CTORs or anything like that? It should always be garbage in, garbage out?
I think that these, I don't consider them garbage. I consider this API to be a view over existing data, and the existing data might be invalid for all kinds of reasons.
Yes, but that would
Right,
be
and that's what the
garbage in.
API needs to return things like, for example, I did find an invalid run, right? And when you convert this to a regular string, it returns as much as it can. And the same thing with other operations, the index operation, the end of operation, all of these things.
Not
just
sure
stop
what you
at
mean
the-
by return as much as it can.
I
I'm sorry?
believe you mean return with replacement, correct?
No, I mean, at least in the Go world, as soon as you hit an invalid character, or, let's say they have a partial UTF-8 input, right? You're missing some characters. It says, hey, I can't proceed further from this point. And you get an invalid, I think it's invalid run error or something
so
like that.
you get some type of stop. Yeah.
So
yes, you get, there's some kind of fence.
So I have to say I'm with Miguel. I'm not, like, this example doesn't convince me, and I'll tell you the reason why. The reason for it is that the right solution to the problem is to validate when you save data to a database. So maybe it's equivalent to what Miguel is saying. At a different level, this problem needs to be solved at a different level. And because we are not preventing people from getting invalid UTF-8 strings by read-only spans of invalid bytes and so on and so on. So
You're assuming
if
the
I'm writing a
database
web,
treats it as a string, though.
So the issue is today that normally you take strings and then code calls encoding.get UTF-8 string,
right?
And then that throws.
It throws or it fixes up.
So that's
Right.
already what's guarding you today, and now
Right.
by having this type, the
But
guard's
having this
gone
type,
away.
the whole assumption is that you just call as bytes when you write to the database directly.
Yeah.
So you lose that layer completely.
And the database doesn't necessarily have to validate. If the database is configured to store ANSI strings, every byte is valid. Like, there's nothing stopping you from sending garbage to it. It's totally legitimate.
as I said, I think the solution is before you write to a database, you validate, because there are so many sources of invalid
Well,
data.
who validates? The application developer?
I think
Probably.
that C# is generally the language of doing things safely. And if we want to have high performance scenarios for people who don't want to pay the cost for validation, that needs to be you have to do more work. You have to call the overload that has more words in it. You have to do whatever. But we should be safe by default. So we should save the users from invalid data. If they have to do an extra step to validate before saving to a database, 99% of our users will
Okay,
not.
I buy that.
So
I think the argument,
basically
right, is
for-
this is like a power user API, right?
Yeah.
So they're already looking at the
That's
documentation. So
this
if they
type
won't
that
want
we're-
validation,
the
they
type
can call
that
the
we're
extra
looking at
API.
here is a simple exchange type API
Yeah.
that I imagine application developers are going to use, not as frequently as string, obviously, but frequently enough that we don't want them to end up in a bad situation from using instances of this type.
Yeah.
So it should be safe by default, and if they want to bypass
That
the
one
safety,
I
that's
find.
their-
What I would not like is there are some things that you cannot do without validation.
I think the constructor should have an overload that doesn't do validation. Or
Well,
just
that's-
have like a bool or something.
That's what this is.
And moreover, when
That's
we
the
talk to
factory
people,
though, right?
I mean, it's basically a constructor.
What's the
yeah.
difference between the constructor and the factory?
Discoverability.
Yeah.
I am okay with making it difficult to do this.
And after
But
getting-
I think the feedback is people would like, even though you
Yeah.
you want to make it difficult by doing half constructors, half factory methods, I think the feedback is like, it'd probably be easier to have just more constructors, more overloads. Possibly ones that throw as well.
In general, we try not to have constructors that sometimes do safe things and sometimes do dangerous things. Let me rephrase. We try not to have methods that, depending on their parameters, sometimes do safe things and sometimes do unsafe things. Generally, we prefer to split them into two different methods, generally speaking.
In particular, it's really hard to write code analysis rules for if you at runtime happen to have pass false to this.
That's fair enough.
And it's really easy to write a runtime rule that says if you call create bytes without validation, please see your security specialist.
You'll be happy to see that I didn't put enter browsable never on this.
So
like
I
did on
guess
everything else.
then if we want to keep them factory methods, then maybe the feedback is I should be able to write that one line of code and have it not word route on me. It's quite long.
Create from validation.
People that call encoding dot UTF-8 dot get string.
Yeah.
What do they call today?
So encoding UTF-8 get string is totally safe.
No,
It's
no, no,
safe.
no, no. I'm saying so. That's the old way.
Yeah.
This is the new way. Is what? What do you call?
What's
I
your
have a
scenario?
static byte.
Yeah.
And I want to get UTF-8 string. I
Just
need
pass it into the constructor.
And that always validates.
Always validates.
And if I don't want that, I have to call create.
If you want it to
without-
non-validate,
Yes.
create without validation. Pass in the read-only span of byte.
I have a feeling we're going to be typing that a lot, though. And
In
that's-
You should not be typing that.
We have to.
Like if you type that, like there will be a code analysis rule that we will run internally that says please don't do
We
this.
validate
Yeah.
on like while parsing, so
Yeah.
don't do it twice. That's the only difference.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
There's no
fine.
point doing it
That's
like
fine.
again
Yeah.
once we.
So why wouldn't we have
Which
a
is your A in
simple
the
create
comments.
method?
Yeah.
that
Sorry?
create without validation that doesn't take a delegate, just takes the byte.
It's in there.
It's there. It's there.
It's there.
It's the last one. It's T though.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's T state.
This should have been here, but yeah.
Yeah,
It,
sorry.
it shouldn't have T state. The last one should just run generic.
Well, this matches string.create.
No, the
T-
last one
T-
stays
no,
in
the last
The last one is not
Doesn't need
doesn't
a-
have
The,
any.
the create
Oh,
without
yes, that's a
validation,
mistake.
Yeah.
Those are
That
mistakes,
is
sorry.
The one that should be char
Copy and paste food.
shouldn't be generic.
Copy and paste food.
Okay, so you do a
Then it
new
would
and it
validate.
copies the bytes and it does validation by default.
Yes.
If I want the fast path, I use this thing which does copy but doesn't validate.
Then you're in a good state there.
And then if we had the validator throw as
You could do
public
that
on
too.
it, then
Yes.
you could debug. You could in a debug build call validator throw immediately after
Yeah.
create without validation. If you wanted that safe path.
And I assume we always want safe path, meaning like before you save to the database, you always need to call this validate method.
No one's going
No.
to do that in practice.
We should,
I'm
have,
saying-
we should have it available.
Then they're
though.
gonna have.
We should.
I'm saying for things like ASP.NET where they're saying we've already validated this
Yeah.
data, then they could do debug assert
Yeah.
is valid, create without validation on substring, and then after that, pound if debug.
No
validate.
matter what ASP.NET does, before we save the data to a database, you're gonna have static analysis tools that tell people too bad. Many people validated before, still validate before you save, correct?
We can do that in O of one time if we need to.
You do that again?
Of course, otherwise you
If he's
risking
saving-
this.
Well, where does that happen?
If he's
Because,
saving
like,
the is valid bit, then it returns.
It's O of one.
No, so like
But
the
it's
model
weird.
the model in EF has
Yeah.
goes from string to UTF-8 string and
Yeah.
you call save changes.
Yeah.
Like
There's
that
no
do?
there's no validation needed there
exactly.
because you've already done transcoding.
So it doesn't happen twice. It doesn't happen
Yeah.
once.
Like anyway.
I think in practice, I agree.
This would be-
with
this
this.
would be
Even
interesting.
if even if it wouldn't happen, nobody would do it by hand.
Yeah.
Like that's just not.
The
good
conversion
work.
from UTF-16 string to UTF-8 string does the validation.
Yeah. Ends with
Should be the same as. Yeah.
should like ends with and starts with are basically the same.
Yeah.
We can also have Unicode scaler take a string comparison parameter if we want to.
What would that even mean?
For example, do you end with the character A, uppercase or lowercase?
Oh, because you're speaking in uppercase.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Or you're in a culture that says that a grav A and or a capital grav A and a lowercase a
Yeah.
happen to be the same thing.
Yeah.
Because that's
Or
what
what
your
people
culture
say.
says.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
we
believe
should,
Linux
especially that we
string
decided
elements
to use defaults
Yeah.
for these, then there's almost no negative.
That is true.
So string dot ends with, at least for full, I'm looking at full framework, sorry.
In next up take a span of
Jeez, you skipped like 9 methods.
All the
no. That's any. Index of it's the UTF-8
Yeah,
string.
we are still like we are.
Oh.
We're on Innsmouth.
We are at end
Isn't that
equals.
the
Yeah, let's-
copy and pasted of
Let's
starts
go in
with?
order.
Like,
Let's go in
it's
order.
the same-
Ends with. Any
same
comments on
feedback.
ends with? Are there any comments on ends with?
Same as starts with.
Well, we definitely had looked at starts
Add
with yet,
default,
so-
default,
so
add default comparison.
Default comparison type? Okay.
Yeah, I wrote that down.
Then you'll all have the same feedback on starts with then. Great.
Yep.
Equals is basically there's equals of string, huh?
Same as string. Yes.
Same as string. The equals of string thing is something that we're going to have to figure out what to do. Just because I don't want to run into a situation where people pass literals in here, and then like now all of a sudden you're taking the runtime transcoding hit. There is no operator equals between UTF-8 string and string for that exact reason. So it's I don't know. I would potentially. I would potentially be willing to
Wait.
remove that overload of equals.
fail? I think equals of string is valuable, but I would have a question about how it does the equality. Like if you make a new UTF-8 string out of a UTF-16 string and it does the conversions, and then you pass a string value that hasn't been converted.
That is not how it behaves, and I actually have a comment there.
Okay.
If you have a string that contains an invalid UTF-16 sequence and you try to compare it against any UTF-8 string, it will always return false, always.
Okay.
It will never be equal to anything else.
So your unknown replacements effectively behave like DB null, where there any comparisons of it are
Kind of.
always.
Yeah. So
considered.
FFFD by itself does not behave as DB null, but if we have to do a replacement as part of equality checking, the thing's not equal.
Yeah, this is
And
pros
if
and
you
cons, but that means
see a
now that you
system
don't
string
want to
that has an
anymore.
unpaired surrogate.
It's just false straight up.
But that means I've a fixed byte sequence in memory that if I compare it against itself, will always say false.
If you have a fixed byte sequence compared against itself, then that means you're comparing string to string or string to UTF-8 string. I'm sorry, or UTF-8 string to UTF-8 string. At which point we're okay, because that's just a byte sequence.
So then why would we consider invalid elements as not
Invalid
being
UTFs,
equal
yeah.
only when you cross encodings?
Because there's no possible way to make a UTF-8 string that represents an invalid UTF-8 string. It's literally impossible to do that.
Well,
Because there's
create
no,
with that validation. Create with that validation.
there's no way to represent an unpaired surrogate in UTF-8.
okay, yeah.
Like even without validation, like UTF-8 just has no concept of it.
And you wouldn't be able to say have the first 2 bytes of a 3-byte sequence UTF-8 string, and there's no system.string equivalent that would ever compare to that.
Yeah. So
So
that's
is it
why they
then-
never compare as equal.
Isn't it then logically equals with string behaves like as if you would have transcoded that string to UTF-8 string without allocations effectively? Is that
Basically, yeah.
yeah. So
It's essentially span of UT or Unicode scalar.sequence equal span.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We compare scalar value by scalar value.
should we have an overload that takes string and string comparison?
Yes, that's what I was about to ask.
We probably should. That would be somewhat difficult, but we're in the business of doing hard things, right? So
Why would it be difficult?
it might be slow.
That wouldn't require allocation.
I need to see what APIs are available on culture. and
Oh, you
for these.
specifically asked for system string.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just asking, why don't we have equals that takes UTF-8 string and string comparison?
Oh, as an instance method?
Yeah.
I don't. Oh, there is one on string. Yeah, sure, we could.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the one that crosses UTF-8 string to string,
Yeah.
if your culture considered ligatures, which would be adjacent scalars, then we need to now pass it a sequence of that, which makes sense.
I'm here with Levi. This is a very difficult trade-off. I kind of understand how people will want to do this, but it's such a shoot yourself in the foot
Yeah.
API.
And to Frederick's question, like, are we going to do lexical comparison? If the string comparison that you pass in is lexical, yes. Like if you pass in a string comparison that would have treated 2 strings as equal, even if they have different lengths, then that would also treat UTF-8 string and string as equal, even if they have different scalars. For example, like the different representations of A with a ring over it, right? You can represent it as a single scalar or as 3 scalars together. So
the Unicode,
depending on the string comparison.
the
that you
Unicode
pass in.
FF combined character versus the ASCII
Yeah,
F
yeah.
followed by ASCII F.
Yep. If your current culture string comparison lets them compare as equal, then they're equal.
S set versus 2
Yeah.
S's. German S set.
Yep.
Just like the Turkish I. That's everything of it.
So what I don't
Comparison
understand-
is hard.
So what I don't understand is why would instance versus non-instance method matter? Because the equals that takes 2 UTF-8 strings and the comparison has the exact same problems.
We said we'd add the string comparison to equals UTF-8 string, but not
Yeah.
to equals system string.
Yeah, I'm missing an overload or a parameter here.
I see, because
But that's why you're all here, to help me catch this in API review.
and the problem with the string one was what?
Yeah, that you can't do a culture sensitive comparison in a meaningful way without allocating one of the two into the other one.
Well, I think also additional problem is this whole concept of all methods being ordinal when you have two different encodings is very strange. Like ordinal implies we just compare bytes.
Yeah.
Well, this one is kind of, I guess,
It's ordinal-ish.
simulated ordinalish. Exactly.
It's ordinal scalar by scalar.
It's goofy though.
Yeah, it's very goofy. Because it has, loses some of the benefits of why people would choose ordinal.
So the only problem that I have is if we don't provide this, what do people do in practice? They have a string somewhere,
They have to
have a UTF-8
transcode
string
and then
somewhere. So the most logical thing for them is they're saying new UTF-8 string passing in the string.
Yeah.
Like, if it had the exact same problems as this approach, then I'd rather have an API that doesn't allocate. It does the exact same thing. If we can do it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like people will do it. I mean, like strings are so pervasive that they will eventually compare the
Well,
UTF-8 string to a
one
string.
solution we could consider is it being a static method. Static method is a bit more, less discoverable. You kind of, in the signature, we can describe what it does, and it's not like accidentally you call that equals and pass a string, and you don't know
Well,
what you just
maybe.
You could. That's the thing, right?
Like, what do we want the equals object that object says you have to have?
Yeah, and that's.
Well, that one is. Okay.
You don't want to throw, I suppose.
I mean, we could add a different method like equals string or something, and have the string go in there. That way, it's very explicit that you're taking UTF-16 data.
I mean, given that equals tags object, I think that.
Transcoding equals.
And then theoretically, you should also take the kind of char.
At the same time, then.
So, this is something that we should have. We're gonna run out of time. This is something that we should have a later discussion on, which is for APIs which take a read-only span of char. Should we just say this isn't the appropriate place to expose those as overloads? Instead, turn this thing into a read-only span and then call dot contains on the span that you get back, because that's going to have overloads that take like read-only span. That way you're doing span to span.
Hmm.
Do you have the span-to-span comparison of UTF-8 data to UTF-16 data? I'm saying the UTF-8 string dot equals, whether it's static or instance system dot string. The UTF-8 data could be ordinal-ish compared against a char sequence.
So that overload, if we want that overload on UTF-8 string between UTF-8 string and string, then we would also want it on span between span of UTF-8 character type and span of char. Like the APIs here should be present on span in some form, right? Because again, we have to consider like the high performance networking scenarios that we have. Like we don't want to leave those in the dust by having stuff only on this type.
I would say don't have this method at all and only add it later if we actually see we need it.
Comparison between UTF-8 and string?
Yeah, because we've
fine.
invented a new comparison type that's not on the enum. That's our special type.
I mean, I do agree with the assessment, but it's probably going to happen fairly soon after this type is added. Somebody's going to have an existing API that gives them a string, and they want to know, this UTF-8 string I got from the new JSON thing, is that
quite
equal
possibly.
to these 11 characters?
Let's see what the feedback is
But
during
it's
the
almost
beta.
good that they will run into a roadblock, they will search, and the answer will be use this complicated API, but at least it explains why and what happens. Versus here, they will just call it and not
I
realize.
think Josh is saying don't add the complicated API.
Yeah.
I'm
No,
saying not the
not
equal
here.
string value.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, we can
Not on
remove
this
that.
as an instance method on this type, but I think we do need to have an API to do that.
Okay,
Actually,
then we just
I really would say
so,
not even.
so
add
the,
that.
not even
the
have
feedback
it at
here
all.
can be kill it on this type.
Yeah.
We need to figure out what that would look like in general, and then add it to. Let's consider it as part of like the helper types or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why would the equal contain UTF-8 string not allocate for culture specific?
Sorry, which one are you talking about?
The equal contain UTF-8 string.
Yeah.
Why would that not end up allocating if you have culture specific comparison?
We might have to, as an internal implementation detail, but I'm trying to work around that.
Well, you could, for example, enumerate
Yeah.
scalar by scalar and compare them.
But that's an internal implementation detail.
doesn't
though,
allocate.
affect the API.
But then
So we should
can't
move
do
on.
the same with the string one?
We should move on.
No, because if you call string
move-
to
we should move on.
UTF-8 string,
We should move on. We should move on.
Just as a tiny quick question on that, are cultures at some point going to be get UTF-8 string added to them?
They're supposed to, yes.
Okay, so then it would be the culture has to
Yes.
do that work.
That is an implementation detail separate from the API discussion here.
Levi, are there things you want to skip ahead to? Because I think you'll get the same feedback on like your index of last.
Yeah, no.
night.
So stuff like this, like this is basically all the same here, right? Let's go to pad. Let's go down to pad.
Pretty much
Pad,
hash
right?
code is fine for everybody. I suppose.
Yeah, get hash code like that's.
It should be get pinnable reference.
Yeah.
It's the same.
By the way, get pinnable reference returns a byte reference rather than a char reference, because if you're calling this, you're almost certainly doing pinbow.
What are we doing for string?
String returns a char reference.
Then you could put a char 8 in your pinbow signature.
You could. I don't think people are going to do that in practice.
They pass.
Well, one more line to provide. I think I'm
Yeah.
fine with that. Why do we do whether was whenever? That seems a bit.
It's get pinnable reference. I believe the recommendation is because it's only supposed to be called by the compiler,
Oh, that's
not by you, the developer.
So you can basically just this is the plumbing to make the
Yeah,
pin.
it makes
keep
the fixed statement
keep-
work.
yeah, okay, that makes sense.
I have a question about is null or empty.
Yeah.
Shouldn't they take spans?
The ones hanging off of the span, like the span-based extension methods, presumably should have is empty and is empty or white space, right? I mean, is empty you don't need because it already exists on span.
But this might be the class that like muscle memory or finger memory.
So we
is
need
what
to
I'm
think
trying
this is a recurring thing.
Yeah.
I think the idea that I like and Steve was pushing was we have this very universal type, span of char, and in this world span of char 8.
Yeah.
We should try to minimize the number of overloads because many types just cast to span. And then you would have this method here, take span of char 8 and everything just casts.
But did we add is null or empty of read-only sequence of char to string?
No. So read-only span already has an is empty property on it.
Right, and you know that once it's a span, it's not null.
It can never be null. But I mean, we could add the overloads.
I mean, I agree with the is null or empty is not that useful, but the
I mean, it's commonly used.
is
Yeah.
white space is very useful
Yeah.
to be able to just call it on the span.
Yep.
I guess my point is if we would add the span ones here, we should add them to string as
I
well.
agree.
Okay.
But we have this for span of char like is white space.
Let's put it down as a no.
Yeah.
We should, we'll add it and keep going.
Okay.
So what was the exact no? Because I was listening to
The
this.
is null or empty, is null or white space has overloads for the
Or
span.
read-only span.
Or at least do whatever we have for
do whatever we have for
Just have the
for
span overload.
UTF-16 string.
Yeah.
It's just a common coding practice, validating at the top of your method.
I.e., there should be a way to do this operation, this query on the span of char 8.
And by the way, like
is white space?
Yeah. Sorry.
It just is white space is what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
For individual characters.
No.
Is white space is an extension method on read-only span of char, correct?
I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. The next thing we'll probably want to go down to is pad left, pad right.
The very last line on the screen.
Yeah.
Email, you can go down a little bit.
It's fine. You can see it from So while Emo's typing, pad left, pad right are the only APIs that take char 8 instead of Unicode scalar as parameters. The reason being that you kind of have to pass in ASCII characters.
Why?
Why? Because what happens if we're asked to pad and the character that you pass in doesn't evenly fit into the amount of white space we need to pad? So you pass in an emoji character, for instance, and you say, okay, pad left to total width 17. And we're like, okay, we wrote out 2 1/4 emoji characters. Like, it seems like the common scenario is going to be people padding with tabs or spaces.
I would just remove these.
I don't think that this belongs here.
Okay.
I don't think that this belongs here because it depends on the terminal implementation. Emojis, like you pointed out, are tricky, but they're not really that bad. Emojis take 1 space. The problem are Chinese characters, and in the console you can make certain assumptions, but you cannot make assumptions beyond that. I mean.
You would just use
I don't
concat
think
and
it
move
will-
on.
Yeah, the problem is like maybe somebody thinks that they're like taking people who use system string right now, they usually think of it as each character will have one printed representation on the string, which is not correct, but it's what our developers think of. So the question is this padding in bytes? Is this padding in scalars? Or is this padding in graphing?
So that, and this padding
Well, I think
specifically is
that,
an
well, in
estimate.
any case,
So,
if you
yeah.
want
Let
to
it
do
use
this, you do it on the Unicode scalar, and what you do is that you compute the length of the Unicode scalar.
I think it's just
Right.
every situation calls for a different one, and we don't want the common wrong one here. Just let the user write it.
Okay, we could kill this on.
Why did we have them originally
Pad left and pad right on string.
on this? Is this with string headed?
Just string headed.
Okay. I was just seeing if there's a
Yeah.
scenario we're killing.
It seems like broken API.
Okay.
I mean, you could pad left, pad right. Like it might make sense for, say, you have indenting JSON writers. Like they might be interested in pad left, pad right. Or you have you're printing a table, like a markdown table or something. Pad left, pad right help there.
But again, that's
you could always do it
mostly
yourself.
that you want resolvable glyphs as opposed to bytes, or so it's.
Would we leave the pad left, pad right overloads that don't take a char 8 and just say they use space?
No, I just
Kill them all? Okay.
Because again, you don't know if they want bytes. Maybe they want the length on the scalars. Maybe they want the length on the bytes. Like we don't know what they want, so make them write it.
Okay.
It's ambiguous.
So string split returns arrays.
Yes, it does. And this would as well for consistency. You can imagine that if we had if you were using read-only memory of char8 or some similar struct, then split would return an enumerator over that substring struct, right? Yep.
So
So is this like a bit of failure for developers here?
Yeah, so I kind of, there's a trade-off between the, do we have same APIs as we have on UTF-16 string?
Yeah.
And so I'm okay with keeping those, but do we have APIs that are better APIs to do the same thing?
Well, better depending on scenario, I guess. Like if your scenario is to avoid allocations as much as possible while using this type, then you could imagine that we have a like a struct split method or something along those lines, and we would also have the same extension method on system string, and that would return read-only memories to you, like an enumerator over read-only memories.
Can we just add an API like this? Like basically,
Yeah, we could
it
design
and
and add it.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think it would replace
But
this.
who
So I
would be
think it
the
would
customer for those? I
augment
mean,
it.
if you have a high performance API, chances are you write a parser. In this case, that will never call these APIs. It literally just scan the string by hand.
I mean, but if
Like
we,
they don't do that much to begin with. I mean,
if
they're
we wrote
convenience
the,
methods.
if this guy only got the one that was the enumerator based split, right, somebody could easily write the array one themselves. The problem is if the array one's in their face, they're going to call it. And then if this one doesn't have it, then the people who start using UTF-8 string realize that they're calling string.split because that's what they're used to, but they could use the struct enumerator on the string. So getting rid of this would actually improve education.
But I think the cliff is so large.
Okay.
I would rather keep those and then add an API and then try, like if you don't care, you don't care.
This is weird
If you
because I think
don't
we're
care-
doing each other's roles on this particular issue.
No, I think this goes back to what the principle of the type is. If you think this is a user-facing type for storage, I think these APIs, as they are right now, make total sense.
Okay.
I think as soon as you make them super complicated to call,
Do we want to collapse all the overloads into minimal default arguments, or do we want to?
We could.
Yeah, we should do that.
Well, I'm asking that.
No, we should generally do this across the
If we're
board.
doing it for the other methods on this, we should follow the same pattern.
Another thing, should we have split that takes span of bytes or char8? Because it's more efficient to search for it.
So I assume that we would have an extension method on span that returns a ref struct enumerator over spans. I don't really know. I don't think it would be a good idea for split to return a ref struct if you pass on a span.
That's not what I said. I said as an input parameter.
Oh, as a separator.
Because the most efficient way to search inside is to search for sequence of bytes.
And then allocate an array.
And you
anyway.
basically don't have a way to search for a sequence of bytes.
You do if you have a literal string.
Well, but then you have to, sure.
I mean,
Literal
if you
string
have a
is
literal,
different.
that's allocation free, right?
So you're just
It's
saying
not free, but
add an overload of the UTF-8 string when it takes a read-only something of char,
yeah.
read-only span of char 8. And then you're just doing
That's your separator.
You're doing index of
Yeah,
on the.
I'm having trouble identifying the scenario for that though.
If I don't want allocations, given that even for literals we will have both allocation.
Your Unicode
And-
scaler, presumably you're doing a stack out extract and building the multi-byte value and then.
No. I mean, if you're literally
We don't do it
the
anywhere
common
else.
case for splitting a string is splitting by literal, and if you pass a literal string in as the separator, things just work.
So why would we do it when split but not an index off? Like if we do this, we need to do it across the board. Otherwise,
Quite
it's
possibly.
very
Let's write down the feedback.
Another
Yeah.
thing,
It
we could consider. So if we
Just consider
design
any
this
place we
more
take a
efficient
Unicode scaler.
API
Yeah.
that returns a numerator, we should just try to make it as efficient down to the metal. Meaning, I can have the separator on the stack. No static data holders, no all the discussion that we had last
Yeah.
week about the overhead of events.
That's a. We should consider what that would look like for string mount as well.
Yeah, maybe like this API is already so allocating that it doesn't matter, but for the non-allocating one,
Yeah.
it
No, and
makes
that's fair.
sense. Yeah.
Right.
You could imagine that we should consider putting split extension methods on memory and span as well, and see what those would look like. Because I think those are going to be the ones that people would use in really high performance scenarios. Consider that if you had it hanging off of span, you don't have to deal with chunk tearing.
So starts with, we can go with no because we already ends
Uh,
with.
Yeah, starts with, ends with, trim, like, I mean, these are all pretty straightforward.
I guess what did index up return? Is that a byte position?
By
Sorry,
position. Code unit
a
position.
code unit.
Yeah.
Okay, and so substring takes a code unit position, and does the second one throw if you tell it that it's going to land in the middle?
So we can detect that. I think the comment that I have at the top of the screen, I don't think we actually need to validate because the natural way that people use substring leads to safety.
I'm just if somebody says substring thingy
Yeah.
index of comma 6.
Yeah.
Well, if they're reading Chinese, 6 is in the middle of the second character. So
Sure.
what does that mean that is valid as false on the return string, or that we threw of I'm sorry you asked me to land in the middle?
So the way that the prototype works right now is it returns an invalid string to it. It clears a flag because it can detect us very easily. I don't think I don't. Let me back up. We should settle on our answer for concat and see how that shakes out because that might affect our answer here. But I actually feel okay in general about this method just because the types of code I've seen people write in practice don't really lend them to doing dangerous things like that.
Well, I understand the first one. But then I'm just wondering, instead of saying length, should we call it code unit length or scalar length, or should we name the thing it's counting? The problem is you have an untyped value here, and we don't know what it is.
We could. I use the term sequence length in a few other APIs, especially those hanging off of the Unicode scaler. But
So the negative of this, I kind of, on one side I agree with you. The
Yeah.
negative is there's a property length on this type. And if these parameters are called length, it kind of implies that they are the same. The
Yeah,
moment
so-
parameters are called something else, then the user is like, are the lengths the same concept or different?
Yeah, so I also would now
Like
like
a
to take this opportunity to say length should be renamed to what kind of length it's measuring. So if it's measuring code units, it should be code unit length. I don't care how long it is, it needs to tell people what it is.
I am not sure.
Or we can Hungarian it.
I had an email
This
thread
will
with
like mock
Miguel, and
out.
he was telling me how Rune is beautiful and
We can go
Unicode scalar is ugly, and code. What did you? Oh, coding unit length is so ugly. It's more ugly than Unicode scalar.
I'm just in terms of system.string, the thing that most people, they're wrong, but what most people think of length as is how many scalars are in it.
No, I think you're just shifting the problem. I think if we make really long identifiers, what you end up doing is you push a whole bunch of content in the developer and you don't get more clarity, you just get more confusion. The opposite is you find a small set of concepts and you stick to them religiously.
And you be consistent, and yes, people have to learn them, but once they learn them, they are super consistent and it's relatively easy to deal with it.
So like I agree with you that we should have a version of length, and we should agree what the best version of length is. Giving people all sorts of lengths is not going to help them. Like that makes it way more likely to make mistakes.
Stick with the char8 length.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like
Just
by the
trying
way,
to figure out what our users do, and our users don't understand surrogate pairs. They think that string.length is how many things are going to draw
That's right.
when they write it down.
I agree with that, but I would say that as Levi said, if you consider people use substring, right, that what ends up happening is the index with a literal, like index of literal, they get back an index. They take that index, pass it into substring. So assuming that the things you get out from parsing or querying are sane offsets.
So I actually,
you're not just throwing a dice and
so
saying,
I actually
give me
have
position 15.
I think initially, when I was kind of thinking about this API, in general, I didn't like the fact that we would have taking index-based APIs on UTF-8 string. And I imagined that the way we would solve the problem of like, we don't have int-based APIs, what would we do? Well, we would have substring that takes the thing that you would search for first. So if your assertion is correct, that first somebody searches for, an index of some delimiter and then substring, well, why not make substring take the delimiter? And then the whole confusion is avoided.
Not really.
Why not?
Like consider all the ways you can match stuff.
Yes.
So now every time you do any sort of operation, multiply these two concepts together.
I don't know.
Yes, you do.
So,
like if you can match by case sensitivity and case insensitivity, like
Sure.
if you have one index of method that does all sorts of querying, and you have another operation that, given an output of this, does the substring, you make these concepts orthogonal and they compose. As soon as you match them together, it means you have one generalist method that now has to handle all sorts of ways you can query and produce new outputs. How would you do that?
So how
Just
many
so
ways
that
do we
people-
have? How many ways do we have to for people to get an index?
So it starts with the fact that index of, you
Index
have
of.
index of, you have last index of, you have
First
comparisons, like what, like how do you want to do
Comparisons
this?
don't return any index. So it's only last
No, it's
index
querying.
of.
No, it's querying. Like, do you match case sensitively or case insensitively? You have to pass in a string comparison,
Sure.
right? So you have these. Then now we talked about outputs. Now you have substring that takes start index and length. So you have to have these two, and now you multiply them. Like that's the number of things you have.
Maybe it's not too bad.
Well, I mean, because if we made
I'm not
substring
sure it's better,
understand
though.
what am I, if it was the needle and haystack problem, you need to have a way of telling it. I'm looking for the third or fourth or fifth occurrence of it. Because with index, you're like, oh, call index of, and then you call index of again, passing the last index of, saying that you're not allowed to return that
So you
one.
want a reader.
Or do we have index of that takes substrings?
We have index of that takes the start position, which is how you skip past.
Oh,
the
we
previous-
have?
I think
Oh.
we did.
I would say this is in the realm of too clever.
Can you scroll down? What's next?
my-
I want to make sure we
actually,
cover.
we should actually scroll up to the very top, not the bottom.
There's nothing else at the bottom you care about.
The thing at the top is actually more important, I think.
Okay.
Right. What's that at the top?
At the top is as bytes, as scalars, as spam.
Jeez,
as
we
memory.
have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Levi, what are you doing?
I'm forcing executive decisions to be made.
So to be clear, we do not have an indexer, right?
There is no
No.
indexer on UTF-8 string. There
So
are
the only-
indexers hanging off of read-only spam.
Is what I'm saying. So there's no indexer on UTF-8 strings. So if you want to index into, you make a decision on what you want to get back. Right?
Well, the only things that you'll ever be able to get back that have indexers are as bytes and as spam.
And as okay.
Well,
yeah.
As scalars doesn't have an
Yeah,
indexer.
and
It
that's
can't.
different.
I don't think it's bad to have an explicit cast either direction, even if the complexity is order in here. If you guys feel strongly that we should only have a 2 string and 2 UTF-8 string to convert back and forth between
So
the two,
the reason
I'll be fine with it. But I think an explicit cast is cleaner in code.
The reason that I avoided an explicit cast is I didn't want developers to run into a situation where they have a string and inside of a loop they're casting the string to a UTF-8 string or vice versa and then passing it on to some other API. If you're calling .toString, that's a very clear indication that you're actually performing an allocation, performing a memory copy, stuff like that. But if you have a simple cast, that doesn't necessarily convey that same message. What that conveys is I'm changing the representation of this, but you don't necessarily know how expensive that representation change is.
I think that's very subtle. I would have both. I would prefer an explicit cast personally, how I type, but
Yeah.
again, I won't die on the hill for this.
I mean, if we want an explicit
I find
cast,
that
we can do it.
rewinding my cursor position and inserting a bunch of parentheses is not usual. I'm not writing.
But so, but what will toString do?
That's
It's
conversion
UTF-8
method.
to UTF-16.
Then why would I cast? Ever?
You could call that method instead. I'm saying
But this doesn't have.
so basically, if you want to go
This is
from
just
string to
This
UTF-8
has
string,
to string. And
Oh,
presumably
the other
system
way.
string.
Yeah.
I'm saying,
Yeah.
from string to UTF-8 string.
just cast.
Sorry?
In this little cluster of four, you don't have a two string.
No, two string. It's alphabetical. At the moment.
Yeah.
Could add a method to object to UTF-8 string.
So, just the quick, why would scalar sequence not have an indexer?
Because UTF-8 sequences are variable length, so the indexer would O of n time, because we would actually have to, you say you want the fifth scalar, well now I have to walk the string in length over fifth, and that
Okay,
means...
so scalar sequence is a low level.
It's a low level walkie type, but that means for int I equals 0, blah, 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 that's now an O of n squared algorithm.
Fair enough, but if you take scalar sequence and
So-
turn it into an array.
So the as memory that here, that has implications on overhead being added to read-only memory for both char 8 and byte, right?
I don't see why there would be overhead for byte.
Is there no way, can I not get a read-only memory of byte in any way from a UTF-8 string?
We were considering ways to kind of fudge read-only memory of byte and read-only memory of char 8, but the experiments that we had didn't add any latency to the existing pipelines.
So how do I write a UTF-8 string to pipelines asynchronously or to a stream asynchronously?
UTF-8 string dot as memory dot as bytes, assuming we have an as bytes extension method.
As bytes goes to span, though. I can't have that in an async method.
No, UTF-8 string dot as memory returns a read-only memory of char 8. Dot as bytes returns a read-only memory of bytes.
It's the new. It's a new method. Steve, you're right. Memory of T needs to be changed for this to work, but we could add this extension method.
No, but it's more than an extension method. I'm trying to understand. So how do I, Levi, how do I call stream.writeAsync?
With UTF-8 string?
Yes.
Stream.writeAsync, like what? So
It takes a
stream.writeAsync
read-only
where you're
byte.
taking bytes, right?
It takes a read-only memory of byte.
It takes a read-only memory byte. UTF-8 string dot as memory, you get back your read-only memory of char 8. Dot as bytes, which gives you a read-only memory of byte, and now you can pass
No,
it
it gives me a read-only span of byte.
No, as
no,
bytes
no.
hanging off of read-only
No.
memory of
Yeah.
char 8 would give you a read-only memory of byte.
Yes. As span.
Yeah, but sorry, well, that means that a read-only memory of byte has to be able to store a UTF-8 string internally. So it has an impact on its implementation. Otherwise, how does the read-only memory of byte wrap the UTF-8 string if it doesn't know about it?
It could be backed by a UTF-8 string, but that doesn't mean that we need to. It doesn't mean that we need to slow the code path for existing
Sure it
instances where it's
does.
backed by an array.
Well, you're going to have to have typecasts to check what the thing is.
Yeah, but we already have those today. We could just order them in the mechanism that's going to be most common.
I think
Yeah,
Steven's argument is
you're
that it's
going to
pretty
be adding a
common
check
scenario,
for
right?
something that doesn't currently have an extra check today.
Yes, however, you can make sure that that check is after the common cases so that you don't regress existing
So
performance.
somebody needs to write the code and just
And
measure
measure.
proof or
Yeah.
whatnot. We are. Is that important for this?
I think it's important from the perspective of saying that this is the API, because if that negative, like we do that with string today with read-only memory of char, but that's because chars are less common than bytes. The high throughput scenarios we have that use read-only memory and read-only span use byte.
Yeah.
And so if you're talking about this API that's public, and this is the way that you use UTF-8 string with these other things, if we're saying that the way that you use it with these other strings is by adding overhead to that implementation, we need to understand what that overhead is. If it's negligible, great. If it's not, that's a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we can get that data.
Or actually, I would just say action item is we need to have a way to convert UTF-8 string to memory of byte.
You just add as byte memory or something.
I mean, that's possible today using Memory Manager. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. It incurs a single allocation.
So just
With
like
no
this
memory
is,
copy.
you know, like think about what's the
Yeah.
best API and add it.
Yeah.
That's an action item is we need to have an API like
Yeah.
this. So before we go into the scalar rune,
We are.
Well, we were out
We're
of
out
time.
of time.
I have very quick one.
Yeah.
Probably not sure. Yeah.
I've heard
This
it
thing is
before.
an enumerator. Can we
s-
not call it sequence? Sequence is a new concept. Like it's not a sequence; it's enumerator or enumerable. We already have a name for these things.
I think you matched it off of string,
I did, but I'm not married to that name.
but I think we can.
No,
call it
well,
enumerator.
string.
I think it's fine with that.
They call it char sequence on string.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like unless we want to stick with the the name.
I could call it scalar enumerable instead of scalar sequence because it implements IEnumerable with Unicode scalar.
Why is it called sequence on string?
It's so string doesn't actually have string has a get enumerator method. So string itself is IEnumerable.
Yeah.
So what they actually return is a char enumerator. It's the IEnumerator of char. So we would have a scalar enumerator, but we also need something that returns that to you. We need something that actually has the get enumerator.
Well, we have
method.
cheated before. Basically, what we have done is we have returned a type, char enumerator or whatever, or like in your case, would be scalar enumerator. It would be enumerator. It would have a method also get enumerator that just returns this.
So return the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
have it implement both.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Because it's a struct anyway, right? So you're not mutating anything.
So
So
it wouldn't be a
char
scalar, it would be
enumerator?
just get enumerator.
Or scalar enumerator.
I think that's what we. I forgot what we. There was another string API
I think
where
it
we
was string
did
builder.
this. I wish it wasn't string builder. Yeah, there's one where we basically said there's an enumerate method or whatever, and that gave you back something called enumerator, and that was enumerable.
Okay, awesome.
Sure.
So now we only have this 5-hour discussion on the
About-
issue.
Just the class versus struct. No big deal.
Oh, that one is yet another 5 hours. So we have 10 hours more.
We've got a couple of
Well,
fun.
regarding that, I have an email.
Thanks,
that I
guys,
sent around
online.
yesterday